It began with a piece of cloth, simple, folded, pinned with quiet dignity. But in France, that cloth became a battlefield. To wear the hijab here was never just about fabric. It was about identity, freedom, and defiance. For decades, French women who chose the hijab found themselves not only covering their hair, but also uncovering a nation's deepest tensions about faith, feminism, and freedom. France, the land of liberty, equality, and fraternity, has always carried another word close to its heart: laïcité, secularism. Born from the French Revolution, laïcité promised to separate church and state, ensuring religion would never dominate politics again. But over the years, that principle hardened into something else, a rigid suspicion of any visible faith in public life. And for Muslim women in hijab, it became a law written across their bodies. The conflict exploded in 1989, in what became known as l'affaire du voile, the scarf affair. 3 schoolgirls in Creil, north of Paris, were suspended for refusing to remove their hijabs in class. The case shocked the country, igniting national debates that still burn today. For some, the scarf was a symbol of oppression, a threat to French secular values. For others, it was a question of rights. Why should a girl be banned from education simply because of what she wore? The girls were young, barely teenagers, but their decision to stand firm shook France. Newspapers filled with arguments, politicians made speeches, and suddenly the hijab was no longer personal, it was political. For French Muslim women, that day was the beginning of a long struggle. Every morning they wrapped their scarves. They also wrapped themselves in resistance. As the years passed, laws followed. In 2004, France banned all ostentatious religious symbols in public schools: hijabs, kippas, large crosses. 2010, a law went further, banning full-face veils in public spaces. Each law came with justification: protecting secularism, ensuring integration, defending women's rights. Yet the women most affected insisted otherwise. "You say you're liberating us," one young woman told a reporter, "but you're just locking us out." Among those who stood at the center of this storm was Mariam Poujatou. In 2018, at just 19, she appeared on French television as the student union president at Paris Sorbonne University, wearing her hijab. Her calm demeanor and articulate defense of students' rights should have been the headline. Instead, the country erupted in outrage. Politicians, even ministers, criticized her hijab. One called it a provocation. Another compared it to oppression. But Mariam did not waver. "My hijab does not define my intelligence or my activism," she said. "It is my choice." For every Mariam, there were countless others, women whose names never reached the news, yet whose choices echoed the same defiance. A law student in Lyon pulled aside in lectures and told her scarf had no place in modern France. A teenager in Marseille forced to remove her scarf before stepping into school gates. A mother in Toulouse humiliated on a bus when a stranger shouted at her to go back home, even though France was the only home she had ever known. Still, they wore it, because for them, the hijab was never about submission. It was about agency. In a world that insisted on defining them, the scarf became their definition. In a society that tried to strip them of visibility, the scarf made them visible on their own terms. And so, the hijab wars of France became more than politics. They became personal stories of courage. One of those stories belonged to Ndella Pay, a black French feminist and activist. She spoke openly against the hypocrisy of banning hijab in the name of women's freedom. "How can you say you are freeing us," she asked, "when you are silencing us?" Her voice carried the truth that many lived but few could say, that hijab was not a prison, but a choice, and that choice was the essence of freedom. Yet, with every act of defiance came consequence. Jobs lost, opportunities closed, dreams delayed. The women of France carried the burden of a nation's contradictions. On one hand, they were told that freedom meant choice. On the other, they were told their choice was unacceptable. The irony was painful. France celebrated fashion icons who wore scarves on runways, Hollywood stars who covered their heads as style statements, Catholic nuns whose veils were considered symbols of devotion. But when Muslim women wore hijab, suddenly it was oppression. And still they wore it. For many, the hijab became more than modesty. It became resistance against double standards, against racism, against the constant question of belonging. Each fold of fabric carried centuries of heritage. Each pin held in place not just hair but history. Yet, their fight was far from over, because the next battleground was not classrooms or workplaces. It was fields of sport. In 2021, a group of young Muslim women footballers in France formed a collective, Les Hijabus. Their dream was simple: to play football like everyone else without removing their hijabs. But when the French Football Federation enforced a rule banning conspicuous religious symbols on the pitch, their dream turned into protest. These young women marched, played street matches outside government buildings, and shouted for a right that others took for granted. "We're told football is about equality and diversity," one player said. "But where is the equality if I cannot play because of my scarf?" The image was striking. Teenage girls, footballs at their feet, scarves on their heads, standing against the machinery of the state. The same cloth that France wanted to erase was now the banner of resistance. And as they ran across the pitch, dribbling with defiance, the question grew louder across the country: who really decides what freedom looks like? The struggle did not end in classrooms. It spilled into every corner of French life, into offices, parliament halls, television debates, and even football pitches. For Muslim women, the hijab was never just fabric. It was a daily negotiation with society. Each morning when they tied their scarves, they weren't simply getting dressed. They were preparing for resistance. In the heart of Paris, Mariam Poujatou walked into a student meeting as the elected head of her university union. At only 19, she was already a leader, articulate, confident, and ready to fight for affordable housing and better education. But when she appeared on television in her hijab, the conversation shifted instantly. Reporters didn't ask about tuition fees or student struggles. They asked about her scarf. Politicians lined up to condemn her. A government minister even said her hijab was not a desirable image for women. Mariam stayed calm. She did not flinch under the cameras. "I am here because students elected me," she said. "Not because of my clothing. My scarf is my choice. My work is my voice." Yet, her face became a lightning rod in France's obsession with the hijab, proof that the mere sight of a Muslim woman leading with confidence was seen as a threat. Outside the glare of cameras, other women fought quieter battles. At workplaces, job interviews ended the moment they stepped in with a hijab. A survey revealed that French women wearing headscarves were far less likely to be hired, even when they had the same qualifications as others. Some were told openly, "We like your CV, but not your look." For those who dared to wear hijab in politics, the backlash was even harsher. Ndella Payet, a French feminist and activist, pushed back against the narrative that hijab was oppression. She marched, she spoke, she wrote, insisting that feminism meant defending a woman's right to choose, even if that choice was hijab. "You cannot liberate women by silencing them," she said. But instead of being celebrated as a feminist, she was painted as a radical. On the streets, everyday discrimination told the same story. Mothers in hijab were asked to remove their scarves when accompanying their children on school trips. Shoppers were followed in stores. Strangers shouted, "Go back home," at women who were as French as the people yelling at them. And still, they wore it. But resistance was not only about surviving. It was about redefining what it meant to be French and Muslim at the same time. For young women like those in Les Hijabus, football became the new battlefield. They grew up loving the sport, playing in schoolyards and dreaming of the national team. Yet when they reached professional levels, the French Football Federation's ban on conspicuous religious symbols stopped them. They could run faster than boys, score goals with grace, and carry the passion of champions, but none of it mattered if they refused to take off their scarves, so they resisted. They formed their own collective, played public matches outside government buildings, and invited journalists to see their struggle. The sight was powerful. Rows of teenage girls in hijabs kicking balls across Parisian streets, laughing, dribbling, scoring, refusing to disappear. They called it not just a game, but a statement. "We belong here. We are France too." One of them, a young striker named Sarah, described what the hijab meant to her on the pitch. "When I wear it, I feel strong," she said. "It's not against football. It's part of who I am. If you ask me to remove it, you're asking me to leave myself behind. And that's not freedom, that's exile." Her words echoed the frustration of thousands. In cafes, in living rooms, in mosques, the conversation repeated, how could France preach freedom yet punish choice? Why were women celebrated for undressing in fashion magazines, but punished for covering on their own terms? The contradictions were suffocating. In 2022, the French Senate even voted in favor of banning hijabs in competitive sports altogether, arguing that neutrality was necessary. Amnesty International condemned the move, calling it a violation of human rights. But for the women affected, it wasn't just a headline. It was their life, their dream, their right ripped away, and yet the more pressure came, the stronger their identity became. What began as a private act of faith turned into a public symbol of resilience. For many young women, hijab was no longer just modesty. It was rebellion, a way of saying, I will not let you define me. They carried it into classrooms, into stadiums, into protests. Each scarf became a banner, not of oppression, but of defiance against a society that wanted to erase their presence. Their defiance came at a cost. Some faced isolation within their own families, accused of bringing unwanted attention. Others struggled with loneliness, especially during Ramadan or Eid, when their non-Muslim relatives did not understand why they were fasting or praying. But in those lonely moments, many discovered something deeper: community. Mosques opened their doors wider for converts and reverts. Support groups formed, circles of women who gathered not just for religious lessons but for sisterhood. They shared stories, tears, laughter, and strength. Together, they found belonging. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. French society, long divided on the hijab, started hearing voices that could not be ignored. Documentaries highlighted the everyday resilience of Muslim women. Open mosque days welcomed curious neighbors. Teachers, lawyers, athletes, women in hijab who succeeded despite the odds, began to rewrite what French identity looked like. And in that rewriting, something beautiful emerged. For centuries, France had prided itself on revolution, the revolution of liberty, equality, fraternity. But perhaps the newest revolution was unfolding quietly, led by women in scarves who refused to bow to anything but their creator. Because freedom, they showed, isn't measured by the length of your hair or the fabric on your head. Freedom is measured by whether you can choose for yourself. Still, the battle was far from over. As hijabi footballers protested, as activists spoke, as mothers walked children to school with scarves tied tighter than ever, the state prepared its next moves. Legal battles climbed to the highest courts. European human rights groups challenged France's restrictions. Politicians sharpened their speeches ahead of elections, using the hijab once again as a symbol in their fight for votes. And the women at the heart of it all? They stood ready, tired, yes, hurt often, but determined. Because for them, the hijab was never just resistance. It was identity. It was freedom. And in the silence after protests, in the quiet moments before prayer, in the unspoken solidarity of a glance between two strangers in scarves on the metro, they knew one thing with certainty: they were not alone. The question now was larger than scarves, larger than women, larger than politics. The question was this: could France learn to accept that freedom sometimes looks different than what it imagines? The protests faded, the headlines shifted, but the women never stopped. In living rooms across France, hijabi women sat with laptops open, studying late into the night. Some trained to become lawyers, determined to defend the very rights that others tried to strip from them. Others became teachers, doctors, entrepreneurs, their scarves tied neatly as they walked into places that had once told them no. Every step they took was a quiet triumph. Their victories were rarely loud, rarely celebrated in newspapers. But they mattered, like the young footballers of Les Hijabouses, who after years of fighting finally saw the conversation turn in their favor. 2025, Amnesty International warned that France's hijab ban in all sports violated human rights, putting global pressure on the country to reconsider. These women, who once had to play football on backstreets and parking lots, had forced the world to listen. They weren't just footballers anymore. They were revolutionaries with football boots, or Mariam Poujatu, who continued to speak calmly despite years of criticism. She did not disappear. She became a symbol, not only for French Muslims, but for anyone who believed in the right to choose. Her hijab, once described as provocation, became a banner of courage, and then there were countless stories hidden from the spotlight. Hijabi mother in Lyon who started her own bakery after losing a job interview, her shop now packed with customers every morning. A hijabi law student in Marseille who won her case after being denied entry to an internship, setting precedent for others. A hijabi nurse in Toulouse who worked through the pandemic, saving lives while wearing the scarf that some claimed was incompatible with French identity. Each of these women carved out a space where none was offered, but triumph was never simple. With every step forward, new challenges emerged. Politicians still used the hijab as a weapon in their campaigns. Laws remained strict. Discrimination lingered in offices, schools, and stadiums. Yet something had changed. The narrative of the hijab in France was no longer written only by those in power. It was being rewritten, word by word, story by story, by the women who lived it. They refused to be silent characters in someone else's play. They became the authors of their own story. For many, hijab was not only resistance anymore, it was empowerment. To wear it in France, a nation that tried to erase it, was to declare, I exist. I belong, I choose. It turned into a form of cultural pride, a fusion of French and Muslim identities that could not be separated. These women were not living in two worlds. They were building a new one, where both identities could coexist. And slowly, parts of French society began to see it. Documentaries showcased Muslim women entrepreneurs. Journalists interviewed hijabi athletes not about their scarves, but about their skills. Younger generations, born and raised in France, questioned the old prejudices of their parents. In schoolyards, kids grew up with hijabi classmates, realizing that scarves were no more threatening than sneakers or backpacks. The world beyond France also took notice. International organizations condemned the hijab bans, calling them discriminatory. Muslim-majority countries raised their voices in solidarity. Social media amplified the stories of French hijabi women, turning them into global symbols of resistance. And perhaps most importantly, the women themselves no longer carried the struggle alone. Community groups flourished, collectives of hijabi women who supported each other, mentored each other, and celebrated each other's wins. They created podcasts, blogs, YouTube channels, and social media pages where they shared their narratives in their own voices, no longer filtered through politicians or journalists. Their stories reached millions directly. One of them wrote, "Every time I walk out with my hijab, I feel like I am carrying my grandmother, my mother, and my daughter with me. I am carrying history, faith, and future all in one. This scarf is not my cage, it is my crown." It was a sentiment repeated again and again. Hijab as empowerment, not limitation. But empowerment does not erase pain. Many still lost jobs. Many still faced insults on the streets. Some still struggled with identity, pulled between being too Muslim for France and too French for their own communities abroad. The wounds were real, and yet they endured, because freedom was never promised. It was fought for. And in France, the fight was far from over. Still, the legacy was undeniable. In every university hall where a hijabi woman now sits proudly, in every football pitch where girls play with scarves tucked in, waiting for laws to change, in every courtroom where a hijabi lawyer argues a case, in every small victory that chips away at prejudice, the French women who found freedom in the hijab had done more than survive. They had reshaped the meaning of freedom itself, not as France imagined it, not as politicians tried to define it, but as they chose it. And perhaps that was the truest form of liberty, the ability to choose even when the world told you not to. The story does not end here. The battles will continue. The debates will return with every election, every new law. But something irreversible has happened. France can no longer talk about the hijab without talking about the women who wear it. Women who are doctors, athletes, mothers, leaders. Women who are French, women who are Muslim, women who are free. And so the final image remains not of defeat but of defiance. A young woman walking through the streets of Paris, Hijab pinned neatly, shoulders straight, eyes forward. She is stared at, whispered about, judged by some. But she does not flinch, because she knows something they don't, that freedom is not given. It is claimed, and she has claimed hers.